The briefing packet in its entirety read, "Attend, represent, do not embarrass us." Ellie Quinn had received worse orders. She had also received better ones. The better ones had at least told her what she was walking into, which meant she spent the 6-jump transit to Veth Station constructing the briefing herself from publicly available conclave documentation, 3 intercepted commercial transmissions, and 1 extremely forthcoming Veth trade liaison who had not realized that accepting a drink from a human woman was the opening move in a negotiation he was not going to win. What she learned: the Veth had been running their aptitude calibration event since before humans had invented writing. 214 species, 214 assessments. The conclave did not explain the test in advance. The conclave did not accept requests for accommodation. The conclave had never, not once, been asked to explain what the test was for by a species that had already agreed to take it. She logged that last fact in a separate column in her notes and labeled it, "Interesting." Veth Station was a smooth thing, all curved corridors and soft consensus hum, built for a species that made decisions by growing quieter together until the right answer crystallized. The architecture assumed agreement. Every junction tapered toward a single path. Ellie walked through it feeling like an argument that had not yet been made. The liaison who met her, facilitator Uv, a designation rather than a name, she gathered, was impeccably polite in the way that assumed politeness would be reciprocated by every variable in the system. Uv had 3 sensory clusters and a translation membrane that flickered faintly blue when processing human phonemes, which Ellie found charming. She told Uv so. Uv's membrane went briefly violet. No data on violet. "The calibration event will commence at the 3rd harmonic," Uv said. "You will be provided all necessary materials at that time. We have administered this assessment to 214 species. The methodology is established." "And how many of those species," Ellie said, "were given advance notice of the methodology?" "None. The assessment measures adaptive response." "Right," she smiled. It was a very specific smile, the one she'd learned in the mirror at age 22 while her reconstructed face was still settling into its new geometry. The one that looked friendly and was not. "So you're measuring how we respond to not knowing what we're being measured on." Uv's membrane flickered. "The assessment measures aptitude." "Sure," said Ellie. She filed that too, in the interesting column. Her quarters were curved and quiet and smelled faintly of something that was not ozone but was playing at it. She sat on the sleeping surface, which yielded in 3 directions simultaneously, and thought about the shape of a test designed to have a single correct solution across 214 species. A single correct solution meant the Veth were not measuring species. They were sorting them. Measuring implied curiosity. Sorting implied a filing system that already had the categories filled in. She was about to be filed. The question was whether she was going to let them pick the drawer. She pulled up everything she had on the species that had passed. 19 of them. 19 out of 214. She started reading the available records on their cognitive architectures, their social structures, their decision-making frameworks. She was looking for the common thread. She found it around the 2nd hour, when the station had gone into something she gathered was the Veth equivalent of night. All 19 species that had passed the calibration event were what you might call consensus-preferring, hive-adjacent. They did not all look like the Veth, but they all, under sufficient pressure, resolved toward unified action. They found the single correct answer because finding single correct answers was how their minds were built. The 195 that had failed were classified as developmental species. Ellie pulled the classification criteria. Developmental species, those exhibiting persistent internal contradiction, adversarial subgroup dynamics, and the demonstrated inability to converge on unified adaptive response. She read that 3 times. Then she laughed, alone in the curved quiet room, loud enough that she was probably disturbing someone's consensus somewhere. Persistent internal contradiction, adversarial subgroup dynamics, the inability to converge. They had just described every functioning democracy, every half-decent marketplace, every marriage she had personally witnessed survive long enough to be interesting. She stopped laughing. She went back to the interesting column in her notes and added, "They don't know what they're testing for. They think they do. They have run this test 214 times, and they have never once noticed that the thing they're calling failure might be a different kind of pass." Tomorrow she was going to take their test. She was going to take it very, very wrong. The test room was circular, because of course it was, with a single interface panel at the center and facilitator Uwe standing at the perimeter like a patient and well-meaning door. 11 other facilitators ranged along the walls. Ellie counted them while appearing to study the room's architecture. 11 observers for one test subject. Either humans were considered high risk, or this was a significant enough event that the conclave wanted witnesses. Possibly both. She was comfortable with both. The assessment, Uwe said, presents a resource allocation problem. You will be given a scenario involving limited resources, multiple competing claimants, and time pressure. The optimal solution maximizes total resource efficiency while minimizing conflict between claimants. There is one correct answer. You have 60 minutes. Is the correct answer the same one the 19 passing species found? Uwe's membrane flickered. The correct answer is derived from established optimization principles. Right, she sat down at the interface. Go ahead. The scenario materialized in the display field. It was exactly what Uwe had described, a closed system, a resource that was running out, 8 claimant groups with different needs, 60 minutes to find the efficient solution. It was a beautifully constructed problem. She could see the correct answer from the first 30 seconds. It was elegant. It minimized conflict by identifying the most efficient distribution pattern and simply asserting it as the outcome. The system model assumed all claimants would accept the optimal distribution once it was calculated. She spent 3 minutes confirming that the correct answer was, in fact, what she thought it was. Then she started working on a different problem entirely. If the claimants weren't going to accept the calculated distribution, if 2 of the 8 groups had a historical conflict the scenario didn't account for, if the enforcement mechanism for implementing the solution wasn't specified, which it wasn't, then the correct answer wasn't a distribution at all. It was a negotiation framework. Something the parties could reach themselves, with a human in the room asking questions, because a solution 8 parties had built together was the only one 8 parties would actually honor. She didn't solve the resource allocation problem. She solved the problem underneath the resource allocation problem. At the 30-minute mark, she submitted her response and sat back. Silence. The facilitators had the quality of a consensus that had not yet finished forming. Their membranes were doing something complicated, cycling through colors she didn't have names for. Uwe's translation surface had gone a color she was going to call pewter and hope for the best. This is, Uwe said finally, not the correct answer. I know, Ellie said. What's the system flagging it as? More silence. The complicated membrane cycling continued. One of the 11 perimeter facilitators produced a sound she thought might be the VETH equivalent of clearing your throat, which meant it was probably the VETH equivalent of suppressed alarm. The system, Uwe said, with the careful precision of someone reading from a document they had not expected to need, is flagging your response as an error. You have not provided a resource distribution solution. You have provided a procedural document. A negotiation framework, Ellie said, for getting the claimants to build the solution themselves, because the scenario doesn't include an enforcement mechanism, which means your optimal distribution is only optimal if everyone agrees to it, which, given groups 4 and 6 have been in a resource dispute for 3 generations, a detail buried in the scenario's background notes. They won't. My solution is less efficient in the short term and produces a stable outcome instead of an optimal one. Uwe was quiet for a long moment. The background notes, Uwe said, are flavor text. They are not intended to be incorporated into the solution. Ellie looked at the facilitator with genuine interest. You gave me information, she said, and you're telling me I wasn't supposed to use it. Pewter deepened towards something she was going to call slate. Around the perimeter, 11 membranes were doing something she decided to interpret as consternation. The background notes, Uwe said more carefully, are present in all 214 prior assessments. No species has previously incorporated them into their solution. Huh, said Ellie. She let that sit for a moment, because it deserved to sit. So I'm the first one who read the whole thing. No answer was itself an answer. She was getting very good at reading Veth silences. I'd like to formally request, she said, that before you file my result, you run my framework against the scenario, with groups 4 and 6's history factored in. See what the outcome model produces. Uwe looked at her. That, Uwe said, is not part of the assessment protocol. I know, said Ellie. I'm asking anyway. Facilitator Uwe returned to her quarters 4 hours later. This was not, apparently, standard procedure. Ellie gathered this from the quality of Uwe's arrival, a faint diffidence in the membrane's color, a slight recalibration of posture that she was reading as the Veth equivalent of not entirely sure this is the right move, but here we are. She poured water, because it was the only thing she had to offer, and gestured at the chair that was not quite the right shape for a human, but was close enough to suggest the Veth had done some research. Uwe sat. The membrane settled into a color she did not have a name for but decided to call honest. The system, Uwe said, does not have a category for your response. Ellie waited. We have 2 classifications available for assessed species. Pass, convergent aptitude confirmed, trade and diplomatic engagement authorized. Developmental, convergent aptitude not demonstrated, managed engagement protocol initiated. Your response demonstrates neither convergent aptitude nor its absence. What does it demonstrate? Uwe's membrane flickered through 3 colors in rapid sequence. That is what the system cannot determine. You identified the correct answer. We have confirmed this internally. You then declined to submit it and submitted an alternative response predicated on information the assessment architecture treats as non-operative. I used all the information I was given. Yes. And that broke your filing system. Uwe was quiet for a moment in a way that felt less like processing and more like sitting with something uncomfortable. Ellie had considerable experience with people sitting with uncomfortable things. She let it breathe. The conclave, Uwe said finally, is discussing how to categorize the result. There are several positions. One faction believes you should be classified as developmental on the grounds that you failed to produce the correct answer. Another believes the correct answer cannot be filed as failed because you demonstrably understood it. A third faction is arguing that the assessment itself requires review. How often does the third faction win arguments in the conclave? The membrane did something she was reading as dry. Rarely, Uwe said. We are a consensus culture. Challenges to established methodology require significant internal pressure to succeed. I imagine, Ellie said, that having an assessed species actively in the room while the argument is happening creates some pressure. A pause, then something she was fairly confident was the closest thing Uwe had to a smile. You are still in the room. I am contractually obligated to remain until the result is filed, Ellie said. I read the assessment agreement very carefully. She had every word, including the sections that were, apparently, flavor text. Uwe's membrane shifted, not to pewter, not to any of the alarm-adjacent colors she'd cataloged, but to something quieter. She decided to call it considering. "May I ask," Uwe said, "why you did not submit the efficient solution? You knew it. The trade authorization would have been immediate." Ellie thought about the 19 species that had passed. She thought about the 195 that had been classified as children who needed managing. She thought about the interesting column. "Because the efficient solution assumes that once you calculate the right answer, everyone accepts it," she said. "And I have never in my entire career seen that happen. Not with humans. Not with anyone I've worked alongside. The Veth conclave runs on consensus. You grow quieter together until the answer crystallizes." "That's extraordinary. That's genuinely not something my species does." She paused. "But it's also not the only way to get 8 groups to share a resource without killing each other. Mine is messier and louder and takes longer and produces something they all actually agreed to. The conclave's way produces something they were told was optimal." Another pause. "I wanted you to see the difference." Uwe was quiet. The honest color on the membrane had deepened into something she did not have a name for and was not going to assign one. Some things you left unnamed. You let them do their work without pinning them down. "The faction arguing for assessment review," Uwe said, "is going to want to speak with you." "I assumed," said Ellie, "that they would." She refilled her water glass and settled in. The conclave was a consensus culture. Consensus took time. She had, per the assessment agreement, every right to remain in this room until the result was filed. She was comfortable with time. She had been rebuilt from scratch once. She knew how to wait for new architecture to settle.